March 6, 1944. At 23,000 feet over Germany, a lone American B-17 flies straight into enemy airspace. No fighter escort, no way out. Behind it, 12 German fighters slide into perfect attack formation, ready to tear the bomber apart in seconds. Inside the tail turret, one gunner makes a decision no manual ever taught him. He won't wait. He won't defend. He will attack first. 4 minutes later, the sky is on fire, and air combat will never be the same again. He didn't look like a hero. No square jaw. No movie star confidence. Michael "Mad Mike" Donovan was a dock worker's son from South Boston, raised in a neighborhood where hesitation got you hurt. His father broke his back on the piers. His older brother boxed Golden Gloves. Mike learned early that waiting was dangerous. Action kept you breathing. By 17, he'd been in more fights than most men see in a lifetime. He lost a few. He remembered everyone. The lesson was always the same. The man who strikes first usually walks away. When Pearl Harbor hit, Donovan didn't hesitate. He enlisted the same day, not chasing glory, just instinctively moving toward the fight. The Army Air Forces wanted him on the ground. He demanded gunnery school. Instructors called him reckless, too aggressive, too willing to expose himself to enemy fire. Donovan didn't argue. He just kept shooting faster than anyone else. He didn't wait for perfect shots. He didn't wait for permission. His philosophy was blunt and unforgettable. Dead gunners don't shoot back. Living ones do. He didn't graduate top of his class for accuracy. He graduated near the top because he could find targets faster than anyone they'd trained. While other gunners waited for fighters to enter the textbook kill zone, Donovan hunted them early before they were ready, before they were comfortable. By March 1944, he was assigned to the 390th Bomb Group in England. His aircraft, a B-17 called Hell's Fury, already carried a reputation. 3 missions, 2 near disasters. The previous tail gunner had survived and immediately asked for transfer. "That position's cursed," he said. "The next man dies there." Donovan volunteered on the spot. The tail gun position was a death sentence. Everyone in the 8th Air Force knew it, even if no one liked to say it out loud. You sat alone, sealed in glass and steel, staring straight into the path of enemy fighters that specialized in killing bombers from behind. No armor, no room to maneuver, just twin 50s and seconds to react. Statistically, more than a third of tail gunners never finished their tour. They didn't get rotated home. They got shot out of the sky. The doctrine was simple and deadly. Wait, let the fighters commit. Conserve ammunition. Fire only when the enemy entered the approved kill zone. Defensive fire, they called it. The idea was to survive long enough for help to arrive or for the fighters to make a mistake. But in practice, it meant the Germans always chose when and how the fight began. They came in organized, disciplined, confident. The bomber crews reacted. The Luftwaffe dictated. German pilots knew the script by heart. 4 to 6 fighters forming high and behind. The lead aircraft soaked up the gunners' attention. The wingmen waited patiently untouched until the moment the American gunner fixated. Then they struck. Cannon fire, shattered glass, silence in the intercom. Another tail gunner gone. Donovan saw the flaw immediately. Everyone was fighting the last second of the attack instead of the first. Every rule assumed fear. Every tactic accepted the idea that the bomber was prey. And every casualty report proved the cost of waiting. When he crawled into the tail of Hell's Fury, Donovan didn't see a cursed position. He saw a forward-facing weapon aimed directly at the enemy's confidence. The Germans expected hesitation. They expected discipline. They expected obedience to rules written by men who didn't sit alone at the back of the plane. Donovan had grown up learning something different. Survival didn't belong to the careful. It belonged to the man who forced the other guy to blink first. If the enemy controlled the timing, you lost. So what if you took it away from them? That question, dangerous, reckless, unthinkable, was about to rewrite the rules of air combat. Donovan reported to the 390th Bomb Group at Framlingham under a low English sky that smelled of fuel rain and burned oil. Rows of battered B-17s sat on the hard stand, each one carrying fresh patches, flak scars, and the quiet weight of crews who hadn't come back. One aircraft drew his attention immediately. Hell's Fury. The name wasn't bravado, it was a warning. The crew already knew her reputation. 3 missions. 2 near catastrophes. German fighters had found her tail every time. The last man who sat back there, Sergeant Eddie Morrison, had survived by inches. Shattered plexiglass, tracers through the turret. When the wheels touched the runway, Morrison climbed out, kissed the ground, and asked for a transfer. "That position's cursed," he told the crew chief. "The next man dies there." Donovan heard that and raised his hand. The pilot, Captain James Whitmore, didn't hide his skepticism. He called Donovan into the briefing room and closed the door. No speeches, no encouragement, just numbers. "You know the odds?" Whitmore asked. "Tail gunners have the highest casualty rate in the 8th Air Force. 38% don't finish their tour." Donovan did the math in his head and smiled. "That gives me 62%, he said. "I'll take it." Whitmore stared at him. "Why?" "Because I don't wait for them to shoot me," Donovan replied. "I shoot first." There was a long silence. Whitmore finally shook his head. "You're either insane," he said, "or exactly what we need." He extended his hand. "Welcome to Hell's Fury." Donovan's first missions confirmed everything he suspected. He didn't sit still. He didn't track politely. He fired early, disrupted formations, forced German pilots to react instead of plan. Other gunners watched in disbelief as fighters broke off before firing a shot. Ammo counts were high. Damage reports were low. Something was changing. Donovan wasn't just filling a vacant seat in a cursed turret. He was about to turn it into the most dangerous place in the sky for the enemy. Donovan's first real test came fast. March 2nd, 1944. Target: a ball-bearing factory deep inside Germany. The kind of place that pulled fighters out of the sky like sharks to blood. As the formation crossed the coast, the tension settled in. Everyone waited for the call. Fighters. 6 o'clock high. This was the moment every tail gunner was trained for. Sit tight, track the lead aircraft, wait until the enemy committed. Donovan didn't wait. At extreme range, while the German fighters were still forming up, he opened fire, not to kill, to interrupt. Tracers ripped through empty sky, cutting straight through the space where the enemy expected calm. The effect was immediate. One fighter broke formation, then another. The attack staggered instead of surged. When a Bf-109 finally committed, Donovan finished it. 1 kill, 2 more damaged. The bomber took no hits. What caught attention wasn't the victory. It was how early it happened. 2 days later, March 4th, Donovan pushed further. This time, he didn't track the lead fighter at all. He aimed at the wingman, the pilot, who wasn't expecting fire, yet the one flying predictable lines to hold formation. When that aircraft exploded, the lead fighter suddenly found himself alone. He broke off instantly. The entire attack collapsed. Back on the ground, the crew chief stared at the empty ammo boxes. "You fired 1,600 rounds," he said. "That's 80% of your load, and we didn't get hit," Donovan replied. "I'll take that trade every time." That night, while others drank or slept, Donovan studied German tactics. He memorized approach angles, formation spacing habits. He realized the truth. No manual admitted American gunners were reacting. German fighters were controlling the fight. So Donovan asked the forbidden question. What if the bomber dictated the terms? What if the most dangerous position on the aircraft stopped waiting for death and went looking for it instead? The answer was coming, and it would arrive in fire. By the night of March 4th, Donovan finally understood what no one had put into words yet. German fighters weren't braver. They weren't better shots. They were simply more comfortable. Every attack followed a rhythm they trusted. Form up. Choose an angle. Commit together. Let the bomber crews panic. The system worked because Americans played their part perfectly by waiting. In the barracks, Donovan spread reconnaissance photos and combat reports across his bunk. He traced approach paths with his finger. 6 o'clock high. Echelon formation. Lead aircraft draws fire. Wingmen kill the gunner. Again and again, the pattern repeated. German pilots didn't improvise in combat. They executed rehearsed choreography. And choreography collapses when the music stops. The manuals told American gunners to react. Donovan saw that as surrender. Reaction meant fear. Reaction meant the enemy owned the clock. The bomber didn't choose when the fight began. The fighter did. And every second of hesitation belonged to the man coming to kill you. So Donovan flipped the problem on its head. What if you attacked before the attack existed? What if you fired while the enemy was still organizing, still thinking, still confident? What if you turned their safest moment into their most dangerous one? Aggression wasn't recklessness. It was timing. It was stealing initiative. It was forcing trained pilots to abandon doctrine and fly on instinct. Break formation once and coordination vanished. Break it twice and courage followed. Donovan wasn't trying to rack up kills. He was trying to poison the attack before it ever started. Make the sky feel hostile. Make the bomber's tail feel radioactive. Make German pilots hesitate where they had never hesitated before. The implications were enormous and terrifying. Burn ammunition early. Expose yourself first. Bet lives on psychology instead of procedure. It went against everything the 8th Air Force taught. It also explained why those teachings kept putting men in the ground. The next mission briefing would bring the moment of truth. If Donovan was right, he could save a bomber by firing a few seconds too early. If he was wrong, hell's fury would be torn apart in front of 8 men who trusted him with their lives. March 6th was coming, and with it, the choice between doctrine and survival. The briefing room was quiet when the target slide snapped into place. Augsburg, an aircraft factory buried deep in Germany, 800 bombers. Intelligence estimated more than 2,000 enemy fighters waiting for them. Losses were expected, heavy losses, the kind of mission where crews memorize faces before takeoff just in case. Captain Whitmore finished the briefing the same way every pilot did. Stay sharp, stay alive. Chairs scraped. Men stood. That's when Donovan raised his hand. "Permission to try something different, sir." Whitmore frowned. Different was dangerous. "Explain." "I want to engage fighters before they commit," Donovan said. "While they're still forming up, force them to defend before they attack." Silence. Everyone knew what that meant. Burn ammo early, empty guns when the real fight came. It went against every rule keeping bombers alive. "You'll be dry before we need you," Whitmore said. "Or I'll prevent the fight altogether," Donovan answered. "Sir, we've been playing defense for 2 years. 38% of tail gunners don't make it home. Maybe it's time we stopped waiting to get shot." Whitmore studied him for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. "One mission. If this goes bad, you're off the gun." They took off at 0647, climbed through cloud, crossed the channel. At 9:19, the call came. "Fighters, 6 o'clock high." Donovan swung the twin 50s. 12 BF 109s. 2,000 yards out. Perfect formation. Calm. Confident. This was the moment every German pilot felt safest. Donovan pulled the trigger. Tracers arced through open sky, far outside normal range. No kills, just presence. The reaction was instant. The formation hesitated. One fighter broke, another drifted wide. The attack lost its shape before it even began. "Cease fire," Whitmore snapped. "You're wasting ammo," Watch Donovan replied. The fighters regrouped, but slower now. Cautious, uncertain. Donovan fired again, short bursts, not to hit, but to dominate space. Then one pilot kept coming. A veteran, unshaken. Donovan let him close. At just over 1,000 yards, he opened up. The sky exploded. The fighter flew straight into the fire, and the rules broke with him. The German pilot never had time to react. 1 second, he was closing, confident, lining up his shot. The next, his aircraft flew straight into a wall of fire. The engine burst. Metal tore free. The fighter disintegrated and vanished beneath the bomber in a spiral of smoke and debris. "Good kill," someone breathed over the intercom. Donovan was already tracking the next target. The remaining fighters regrouped fast. They'd learned their lesson. No more neat formations. They split 6, coming straight down, the tail 5, peeling off to the 7 o'clock position, trying to divide his attention. That was the standard counter. Overwhelm the gunner, force hesitation. Donovan didn't hesitate. "I'm holding 6, he called. "Waist gunner 7. He ignored the threat on his flank and poured everything into the direct stern attack. The lead fighter filled his sights. Donovan fired. The aircraft exploded. Before the wreckage cleared, he shifted to the next lead. Fired again. Another fireball. In less than 30 seconds, 3 German fighters fell out of the sky. The rest broke. Not repositioning, not regrouping. They ran. Whitmore's voice cracked over the intercom. "They're disengaging." Donovan checked his ammo. 1,200 rounds gone, 800 left. Enough if the Germans stayed scared. They didn't. 15 minutes later, radar picked them up again. 18 fighters this time. A full staffel, multiple attack vectors. A deliberate attempt to crush the tail position once and for all. This was where doctrine said to spread fire cover, every angle, and hope. Donovan chose violence. He locked onto the 6 fighters coming straight down the tail, 7 seconds. That's all he had. He opened fire at maximum effective range and never let up. Tracers walked straight into the lead fighter's path. The pilot held course 1 second too long. Fatal. 5 left. 3 seconds. Donovan fired on instinct, leading where physics demanded. Another fighter flew into the stream. Explosion. Flames. Panic. The survivors broke hard and fled. 2 kills in 3 seconds. Donovan reloaded his last belt. 400 rounds left. The mission was only halfway over, and the sky was about to get much worse. The formation pressed on toward Augsburg, engines' droning nerves stretched thin. Below them was Germany. Above them, the storm was rebuilding. The fighters that survived didn't come back in screaming dives. They shadowed the bombers instead just outside gun range, watching, waiting. Whitmore recognized it immediately. They were calling in reinforcements. 10 minutes later, the sky answered. 36 new contacts appeared on radar. FW-190s and BF-109s pouring in, joining the 12 already stalking them. 48 fighters now hunted Hell's Fury. No escort, no friendly bombers nearby. The nearest formation was 3 miles away. They were alone. Donovan checked his ammo. 380 rounds. The math was ugly. Whitmore's voice came calm, too calm. "We can't take that many." Donovan keyed his mic. "Permission to try something." Silence. "Those fighters are still organizing," he said. "If we wait, they'll hit us from every angle at once. We won't survive that. But if I engage now while they're forming, I can break them before they're ready. You'll be out of ammo in half a minute. Then it has to count." Whitmore thought for 3 seconds. "Do it." Donovan opened fire at 2,000 yards. Not bursts, not warnings. A sustained barrage aimed at the heart of the formation. He wasn't targeting planes. He was targeting order. Tracers ripped through the space where coordination lived. The effect was catastrophic. 1 fighter caught fire. 2 collided trying to evade. The rest scattered in blind panic. 48 aircraft dissolved into chaos. No attack, no plan, just survival. But Donovan knew the truth. He'd bought time, nothing more. 90 seconds later, the Germans came back angrier, faster, uncoordinated. 12 fighters swarmed straight down the tail. No formation, no fear. Donovan fired into the center of the pack. Burst, burst, burst. Aircraft exploded. Others broke off through trailing smoke. Cannon fire flashed past the turret. Metal screamed. The bomber shuddered. He kept firing. 200 yards, 100. Then silence. "I'm out," Donovan said. "Dry on all guns." The sky went very quiet, and the fighters were still coming. The fighters closed in, slow and deliberate, now confident, disciplined. They knew the tail guns were silent. 6 o'clock low, the one angle Donovan couldn't cover anymore. This wasn't an attack. It was an execution. Donovan watched them come. 400 yards, 300. He felt no panic, no rush, only clarity. He had no ammunition left, no steel, no noise. But he still had something the Germans couldn't measure: fear. He traversed the twin 50s, smoothly tracking the lead fighter with perfect precision. The barrel stayed locked on the cockpit, steady, disciplined, exactly the way a loaded gun would look. No hesitation, no shaking, just certainty. The German pilot saw it. He saw those guns following him, unwavering. He remembered the fireballs, the collapsing formations, the pilots who never made it home. Instinct took over before logic could catch up. He broke hard to the right, and the formation followed. In seconds, the attack unraveled. Fighters peeled away, scattering, abandoning the run they should have pressed. Not because Donovan could kill them, but because they believed he could. Reputation filled the empty guns. Memory did the work of ammunition. "They're breaking off," someone whispered over the intercom. "They're actually breaking off." The Germans didn't regroup. They didn't try again. 27 fighters turned away from a single bomber with no tail ammo left. The cost had been too high. 21 aircraft lost. Too many friends gone. Whatever was back there in the tail wasn't worth dying for. Hell's Fury flew on alone through hostile sky, wounded but alive. She reached Augsburg, dropped her bombs, turned for home. Later, back on the ground, they counted 47 bullet holes, 13 cannon strikes. Every round Donovan had carried was gone. 2,000 bullets fired, nothing wasted. 12 confirmed kills, 4 probables, 3 damaged. But the real number couldn't be written down, because on that day over Germany, one tail gunner proved something no manual ever taught. Sometimes survival doesn't come from firepower. Sometimes it comes from making the enemy too scared to pull the trigger. The impact hit before the engines cooled. Word moved faster than paperwork ever could. By nightfall, every crew at Framlingham was talking about the tail gunner who didn't wait, who didn't hide, who turned the most vulnerable seat in a bomber into a weapon. By morning, pilots from other groups were asking questions. By afternoon, headquarters wanted answers. Donovan didn't celebrate. He cleaned his guns, rechecked mounts, did what he always did. But the numbers were impossible to ignore. One bomber, one mission. Enemy attacks broken before they began. Fighters aborting runs they would have pressed weeks earlier. Something fundamental had shifted in the sky. Within days, officers were taking notes. Within weeks, Donovan was pulled from combat and ordered to teach. Not everyone liked it. Old school instructors called it reckless. Commanders worried about ammunition. Some said it was dressed up as courage. Then the statistics came in. Tail gunner casualties dropped. Attack completion rates collapsed. German fighters began breaking off early, sometimes at the first tracer. Crews started coming home with empty ammo boxes and intact aircraft. Survival followed aggression. What Donovan had proven wasn't about marksmanship. It was about initiative, about psychology, about making the enemy react instead of plan. Fear once owned by the bomber crews had changed sides. The doctrine spread quietly at first, then everywhere. Men who learned it survived. Men who mastered it became legends. And German pilots noticed. Radio intercepts warned of aggressive American gunners. Certain bombers were marked, avoided. By summer 1944, the balance had tipped, not because the bombers were stronger, but because they were no longer passive. All of it traced back to one decision made in a glass turret over Germany. One moment when a man chose not to wait, and the sky remembered. The war ended without ceremony for Michael Donovan. No parades, no speeches. When the guns finally went quiet, he went home to South Boston and disappeared back into the noise of ordinary life. He worked construction, raised a family, kept his head down. To neighbors, he was just another man who came back and got on with it. He never talked about the sky over Germany, never mentioned Augsburg, never counted the fighters. When reporters found him years later and asked about his role in the war, he shut them down with a sentence that ended every question. "I did what needed doing." So did a lot of other men. History moved on without him noticing. His tactics didn't. Military planners studied them. Air forces rewrote manuals. Aggressive defense became standard thinking, not just in bombers, but everywhere. Men had to survive under fire. The idea was simple: dangerous and permanent seize. Initiative or die waiting. Donovan never knew the numbers. He never saw the reports crediting his doctrine with hundreds of saved aircraft, thousands of lives carried home instead of buried overseas. He never heard the German radio intercepts warning pilots to avoid American bombers that fired too early, too hard, too confidently. He died in 1998. Quiet funeral, family, a few old friends. No honor guard, no salute. Just another working man laid to rest. But the men he trained remembered. The gunners who lived because they learned to act instead of wait. They gathered without uniforms or ranks, raised glasses, and told stories about the man who taught them that fear shrinks when you move first. March 6, 1944, lasted 4 minutes. Its echo is still flying. Because sometimes history doesn't change with orders or speeches, or sometimes it changes when one man refuses to wait for death and goes hunting instead. 3:17 a.m. Detroit, 1941. 2 engines roar inside a Packard factory. But this isn't a test run, it's a gamble. If they fail, American bombers die in the sky. If they succeed, they change the course of World War II forever. The engines kept running. Inside Packard's East Grand Boulevard plant, the noise was deafening, raw metallic, alive. 2 Merlin engines identical in silhouette. To their British counterparts shook the test stands as engineers leaned forward holding their breath. This wasn't a ceremony. There were no speeches, just clipboards, oil-stained coats, and men who knew exactly what was at stake. Because these engines were never supposed to exist. Rolls-Royce Merlins were works of art, built by hand, touched and adjusted by craftsmen who trusted feel more than numbers. Every tolerance assumed a human would make it fit. Detroit didn't work that way. Detroit demanded certainty, repeatability, numbers that never changed. And yet, here they were. American-built Merlins forged from British blueprints that had been torn apart, rewritten, and rebuilt from the ground up. 14,000 parts, every bolt thread recut, every tolerance tightened. No hand fitting, no second chances. If Packard was wrong by 1,000th of an inch, the engine would tear itself apart at 30,000 feet. Pilots would never know why. Bombers would keep flying unescorted. Crews would keep dying. The men in that room understood something the world did not. This test wasn't about engines. It was about whether American mass production could master precision without losing soul. Whether a nation built on assembly lines could equal and maybe surpass old world craftsmanship. As the engines roared on smooth and steady, one truth became clear. This wasn't just a successful test. It was the first sound of a war beginning to turn. The roar in Detroit meant nothing if it couldn't reach the sky where the war was being lost. In early 1942, the U.S. Army Air Forces faced a cruel paradox. They had a fighter they loved and a war it couldn't fight. The P-51 Mustang was fast, sleek, deadly close to the ground. Below 15,000 feet, it could outfly almost anything in the air. Pilots trusted it. They admired it. But the moment they climbed higher, the airplane betrayed them. As altitude increased, The engine began to choke. Air thinned. Power bled away. At 25,000 feet, where American bombers lived and died, the Mustang was gasping for breath. German fighters weren't. They waited above the bomber streams like hunters on a ridge, then dove through the formation with guns blazing, untouched and unstoppable. The bomber crews knew the math. They flew straight and slow deep into Germany with no fighter escort that could stay with them. Mission after mission, they watched friends vanish in fire and smoke. In August 1943, 60 bombers failed to return from a single raid. No miracle tactics, no heroic maneuvers, just physics doing what physics always does. The problem wasn't the Mustang's wings. North American aviation had built a masterpiece. The problem was its heart. The Allison engine powering it used a single-stage supercharger perfect for low altitude, useless where the war demanded performance. What the Army Air Forces needed wasn't a new airplane. They needed altitude, they needed pressure, they needed power where none existed. 3,000 miles away in Derby, England, the answer was already screaming across the sky. Spitfires weren't struggling at 30,000 feet. They were thriving. And buried inside their noses was an engine built for heights the Allison could never reach. The war didn't need a better pilot. It needed a different kind of engine. The answer existed, but it came with a price no one in America had ever paid before. At Rolls-Royce's factory in Derby, the Merlin engine wasn't treated like a machine. It was treated like a living thing. 14,000 individual parts, each one shaped, measured, and fitted by hand. When something didn't align, craftsmen didn't reject it, they corrected it, filed it, adjusted it, made it right by feel. This was old-world engineering at its finest. And it worked. The Merlin's secret was its two-stage, two-speed supercharger, an elegant, brutal solution to the thin air of high altitude. While American engines suffocated, the Merlin forced air into its cylinders with relentless precision, maintaining sea-level pressure at heights where men blacked out and metal grew brittle. At 30,000 feet, it still had power to spare. Spitfires and Hurricanes proved it every day over Europe. They climbed, they fought, they survived. But there was a problem no boost gauge could fix. Britain was running out of time and capacity. Even with factories running day and night under blackout conditions, Rolls-Royce could only build about 200 Merlins a week. They needed 10 times that number. Bombers were being shot down faster than engines could be built. Pilots were dying while waiting for production schedules to catch up. So Britain did something unthinkable. They handed their most precious engine, the crown jewel of British engineering, to America. Blueprints, complete engines, trade secrets refined over decades. And they asked Detroit to do what no one believed possible: take an engine designed for craftsmen and force it through an assembly line without changing a single dimension, without losing a single horsepower. It wasn't just a technical challenge. It was a clash of philosophies. Rolls-Royce built perfection through hands. America built power through systems. If Detroit failed, the Merlin would lose its soul. If they succeeded, the war might finally have a chance to turn. The question wasn't whether Packard-Bell could build the Merlin. It was whether precision itself could be mass-produced. The crates arrived quietly. Inside them were Merlin engines' blueprints and assumptions that had never been questioned. When Rolls-Royce engineers stepped into Packard's offices in Detroit, they expected admiration. What they got instead was silence. Packard's engineers spread the drawings across drafting tables and began to read them the way Detroit always did, with numbers, not reverence. And almost immediately they saw the problem. Not one problem, thousands of them. Nothing matched. The measurements were imperial, but not American imperial. Dimensions referenced standards that predated modern manufacturing. Tolerances weren't instructions. They were suggestions. They assumed a man with a file would be standing there at the end, correcting imperfections by hand. Then there were the threads. Every bolt, every nut followed the British Whitworth system, 55-degree angles, rounded roots, a geometry no American factory used. These fasteners couldn't be replaced. They couldn't be approximated. Change them, and the engine would no longer be a Merlin. And worst of all, the tolerances. Rolls-Royce allowed variation because craftsmen compensated for it. Detroit couldn't. American mass production lived and died on interchangeability. Any piston had to fit any block. Any bearing had to work in any engine. No filing, no judgment calls, no second chances. The British engineers were polite confident. This was how Merlins had always been built. Then Packard's lead engineer looked up and said something that froze the room. "Your tolerances are too loose." To Rolls-Royce, it sounded like heresy. To Detroit, it was simply fact. Packard wasn't saying the Merlin was flawed. They were saying it was unfinished, at least by American standards. If this engine was going to win a war, it needed to be defined down to the last thousandth of an inch. What followed wasn't copying. It was translation. Packard made a decision that would change everything. They would keep the Merlin soul intact, but they would rebuild its language entirely. Every dimension would be respecified, every process rethought, every assumption challenged. This wasn't about making a British engine in America. It was about proving that precision didn't belong to craftsmen alone. It could belong to a system. Once the decision was made, there was no turning back. Packard didn't ease into the work, they detonated it. Drafting rooms filled overnight. Slide rules came out. The original Rolls-Royce drawings weren't discarded, but they were no longer sacred. They were dissected, interrogated, translated. Over the next 11 months, Packard engineers produced more than 6,000 new technical drawings. Not because the British plans were wrong, but because they were incomplete by American standards. Every dimension was redefined, every tolerance tightened, every process reimagined for machines that never got tired and operators who followed procedures instead of instinct. This was where philosophy became metal. Rolls-Royce expected variation and correction. Packard demanded certainty. If a crankshaft journal was specified at a diameter, it had to be that number every time, not close, not good enough. Because at 30,000 feet, almost right meant catastrophic failure. The breakthroughs came in places no one expected. Take the bearings. Rolls-Royce used a copper-lead alloy that worked if carefully broken in and constantly inspected. Packard's metallurgists saw risk, heat, wear, failure, over time. Drawing on American aircraft research, they replaced it with a silver lead alloy plated with indium. The silver carried higher loads. The indium created a microscopic cushion that reduced friction and smoothed break-in. The British engineers objected immediately. That wasn't the specification. Then the test data came in. The Packard bearings ran cooler. They lasted longer. They survived abuse the originals could not. Quietly, without announcement, Rolls-Royce adopted the American design. This is where the story changes. Packard wasn't just preserving the Merlin. They were improving it without increasing power, without altering performance numbers, without betraying its design. The engine didn't become different. It became stronger, more consistent, more predictable. What Packard proved in those drafting rooms was revolutionary precision didn't have to be protected by craftsmen alone. It could be enforced by process, guaranteed by systems. The Merlin was no longer just an engine built by hands. It was becoming an engine defined by math and ready for war. If the Merlin was going to survive mass production, it would live or die on the smallest details. And nothing was smaller or more dangerous than threads. Every Merlin engine used British Whitworth fasteners, 55-degree angles, rounded roots, a geometry foreign to American factories. These weren't cosmetic choices. Threads held the engine together under vibration heat and combat stress. Change them, and the Merlin stopped being a Merlin. Packard had two options: convert everything to American threads and break compatibility with British aircraft, or do the impossible. They chose the impossible. Packard built an entirely new manufacturing ecosystem just to make British threads at American precision. Every tap, every die, every thread-cutting tool had to be custom designed and built from scratch. They imported specialized British measuring equipment and trained machinists in systems most had never heard of: Whitworth for coarse loads, British Standard Fine for precision joints, British Association threads for instruments. This wasn't compromise, it was obsession. The result was radical. A bolt made in Detroit could screw perfectly into an engine built in Derby. Parts could be swapped across oceans without hesitation. But here's the twist. Packard's threads were more consistent than the originals. They didn't rely on hand correction. They didn't drift. Every fastener landed exactly where it belonged. Then came the supercharger, the Merlin's beating heart. 2 impellers, 2 gear ratios, 30,000 revolutions per minute. At those speeds, imbalance meant destruction. Rolls-Royce balanced them by hand, shaving material until instinct said enough. Packard replaced instinct with measurement, precision casting, controlled machining, dedicated dynamic balancing rigs that measured vibration while the impeller was spinning at speed. Fewer adjustments, faster production, identical results every time. Even the cooling system was rethought. Compressed air burned hot over 200 degrees Celsius. Packard redesigned coolant passages to flow better, cast cleaner, cool more efficiently. Nothing changed on paper. Everything improved in practice. Piece by piece, Packard proved a brutal truth. The Merlin didn't need to be protected from mass production. Mass production needed to be precise enough to deserve the Merlin. By the time Packard finished solving the Merlin, the real challenge finally arrived. One perfect engine meant nothing. War demanded thousands. The test stand's success proved the theory. Now Detroit had to prove the system. Packard didn't adapt an existing factory. They rebuilt it into something entirely new. The East Grand Boulevard plant became a precision battlefield. Every machine had a single purpose. Every station performed one operation, measured, recorded, and verified. Nothing moved forward unless it was exact. This was mass production without forgiveness. A crankshaft wasn't within range. It was correct or it was scrap. A bearing journal wasn't close. It was dead on every time. Packard engineers introduced statistical process control long before it became standard practice. Deviations weren't fixed by craftsmen, they were eliminated at the source. This changed who could build an aircraft engine. You didn't need a master fitter with decades of experience. You needed training discipline and machines designed to never drift. The human factor didn't disappear, but it moved upstream into design tooling and process control. Production climbed relentlessly through 1942. By 1943, something unthinkable happened. Packard wasn't struggling to meet demand. They were outrunning it. At peak output, the Detroit plant completed nearly 400 Merlin engines every single week, more than all British Rolls-Royce factories combined. These weren't experimental engines. They were combat-ready, interchangeable, identical down to the last thousandth of an inch. Engines built weeks apart could swap parts without hesitation. Maintenance crews noticed immediately. Reliability soared. Confidence followed. This was the moment the Merlin stopped being rare. It became inevitable. The engine that once depended on craftsmen was now carried forward by a system that never slept. And with every crate leaving Detroit, the balance in the air war shifted. The Merlin was no longer Britain's secret weapon. It was America's industrial answer to total war. Once the Merlin could be built at scale, everything changed, and it happened faster than anyone expected. North American aviation took Packard's engines and installed them into the Mustang almost as an afterthought. Same airframe, same wings, same pilot. But when the throttle went forward, this was no longer the same airplane. The Mustang climbed, and it didn't stop. At altitudes where the Allison-powered fighters had wheezed and fallen behind, the Merlin-powered P-51 kept pulling. 25,000 feet, 30,000. Higher still, the supercharger screamed the prop bit into thin air, and power stayed right where the pilots needed it. German fighters that once owned the high ground suddenly found themselves matched or beaten by American escorts that could stay with the bombers all the way in and all the way out. The change was immediate and brutal. Bomber crews noticed first. The long, silent stretches without escort were gone. The lonely minutes waiting for enemy attacks disappeared. Mustangs stayed overhead, weaving above the formations, hunting instead of reacting. Luftwaffe pilots noticed too. Their old tactic climb above, dive through, escape upward no longer worked. The Americans were already there. The Packard-built Merlin didn't just improve the Mustang, it completed it. The P-51B and later the iconic P-51D with its bubble canopy became exactly what the war demanded: a long-range escort fighter that could fight at altitude, chase enemies to the deck, and fly to Berlin and back. The engine held together under punishment mission after mission because it wasn't just powerful, it was consistent. Identical engines behaved identically. Pilots trusted them. Mechanics depended on them. Commanders planned around them. This was the moment the air war tipped. The Mustang didn't win because of a single dogfight or a legendary ace. It won because its engine showed up every day exactly the same, in numbers the enemy couldn't match. Detroit hadn't just solved a manufacturing problem. They had given the war an answer, and the sky belonged to whoever could build it fastest. By 1944, the numbers told a story the enemy could no longer ignore. Packard didn't just meet demand, they overwhelmed it. Engine crates left Detroit in a steady, unstoppable flow, each one identical, each one ready for combat the moment it was bolted into an airframe. By the time production peaked, Packard was building Merlin engines faster than planes could be finished to receive them. This had never happened before in aviation warfare. The Luftwaffe felt it in the air. Every mission over Germany now had escorts. Not part way, not to the border, all the way. American Mustangs appeared at altitude already waiting, already fast, already climbing. German pilots called the sound of the Merlin at height something new, something frightening. It meant the Americans weren't leaving. Behind that sound was an industrial reality the Axis could not match. At the end of the war, Packard had produced more than 5,000 Merlin engines, more than all Rolls-Royce factories in Britain combined. Each one built to a standard so precise that parts were interchangeable across oceans, across factories, across years. This consistency changed everything. Maintenance times dropped. Reliability soared. Engines stayed on the wing longer. Aircraft availability increased. The air war became a numbers game, and America finally had the numbers. But the real victory wasn't just in combat statistics. It was in what Packard proved. Precision and mass production were not enemies. They were partners if you understood the system deeply enough. The techniques developed for the Merlin didn't vanish when the war ended. They became the foundation of modern aerospace manufacturing. Precision casting, process control, dedicated tooling. These ideas carried forward into jet engines, into spaceflight, into every aircraft that would follow. The Packard Merlin wasn't just a wartime solution. It was a turning point. An engine born from British innovation, transformed by American manufacturing, and unleashed at a scale that decided who would control the skies. When the war demanded the impossible, Detroit didn't improvise. It engineered inevitability. When the war ended, the Merlin didn't fade into history. It simply changed form. The factories slowed. The test stands fell quiet. But what Packard had built in Detroit didn't stop with the last engine off the line. The real legacy wasn't metal, it was method. A new way of thinking about precision, scale, and trust in systems that would define aviation for the rest of the century. The techniques born from desperation became doctrine. Statistical process control, precision casting, interchangeable components built so consistently that human correction was no longer required. These ideas didn't belong to wartime anymore. They migrated into jet engines, into commercial airliners, into spacecraft. Every modern aircraft carries echoes of what Packard proved in 1941. Perfection doesn't have to be handcrafted if the system itself is perfect. The Merlin's influence reached even deeper. The bearing technology Packard pioneered reshaped post-war automotive engineering. The obsession with thread compatibility foreshadowed global standards that would later prevent logistical nightmares across continents. Engineers learned a hard truth from the war machines: don't fight alone. Systems do. And systems must speak the same language. Even today, the Merlin still breathes. Packard built engines power flying warbirds roaring across air shows, their sound instantly recognizable. At Reno, modified Merlins push 3 times their original horsepower, proving the strength of a design never meant to be disposable. 80 years later, they still run, still endure, still matter. But the most important legacy isn't what survived, it's what was proven. The Packard Merlin was never about one nation outdoing another. It was about two engineering philosophies meeting under impossible pressure and choosing cooperation over pride. British innovation gave the world a masterpiece. American manufacturing gave it scale. Alone, neither was enough. Together, they changed history. The next time you hear a Merlin howl, remember this: you're not just hearing an engine. You're hearing the moment precision learned to move at the speed of war and never stopped. The war didn't end with a final engine shutdown. It ended with a sound that refused to be forgotten. Even today, when a P-51 Mustang lifts off the runway and that Merlin engine clears its throat, people stop. Conversations die. Heads turn. Because that sound isn't just horsepower, it's memory. It's the echo of a moment when failure meant annihilation and success meant survival for thousands who would never know the names of the men who made it possible. The Mustang earned its legend in the skies over Europe. Pilots became heroes. Victories filled history books. But buried beneath every mission, every escort to Berlin and back, was a truth rarely spoken out loud. The P-51 didn't dominate because it was beautiful. It dominated because its engine showed up every single day, unchanged, predictable, unbreakable. That reliability wasn't accidental, it was engineered. 14,000 parts, 6,000 redrawn blueprints, 11 months of relentless pressure. Packard proved that craftsmanship and mass production were never enemies, only misunderstood partners. They respected British innovation enough to preserve it. They trusted American systems enough to scale it. And in doing so, they built something neither nation could have achieved alone. This wasn't a story about copying. It was a story about translation. The Merlin spoke British engineering fluently. Packard taught it to speak the language of total war. Together, they turned precision into volume elegance, into inevitability. The result wasn't just an engine, it was air superiority made mechanical. History often celebrates the battles. This story belongs to the people who solve problems instead. The next time you hear that Merlin howl, remember what you're really listening to. You're hearing two philosophies meet under impossible pressure and refuse to break. You're hearing the moment industry became a weapon. Not louder than the enemy, not faster, just relentless. In 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces believed the P-47 Thunderbolt was a failure, too heavy, too slow, unable to dogfight. But one commander refused to change the aircraft. He changed the way war was fought. So how did he turn a lost cause into a weapon that terrified the Luftwaffe? And what really happened in the deadly skies over Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943. October 1943. High above Europe, the air war was going badly for the United States. American bombers were flying deeper into Germany than ever before and paying for it in blood. Every mission meant burned aircraft, missing crews, and formations ripped apart by German fighters waiting patiently above them. The escort fighter meant to protect those bombers was the P-47 Thunderbolt. And by late 1943, almost everyone agreed on one thing: the P-47 was a mistake. It was massive, over 7 tons of metal fuel and ammunition. Its German opponents, the FW-190s and Bf-109s, were lighter, faster to turn, and perfectly suited for classic dogfights. In a turning fight, the math was brutal. At 15,000 feet, a German fighter could complete a full circle 6 seconds faster than a P-47. 6 seconds in aerial combat wasn't an inconvenience. It was death. American pilots learned this the hard way. When German fighters attacked, they broke formation, climbed dove, and turned with confidence, knowing the heavy thunderbolts could not follow them through tight maneuvers. Bomber crews saw it too. They watched their escorts fall behind, unable to stay with the enemy through the turns. They watched German fighters escape, regroup, and strike again. Losses mounted. Generals at 8th Air Force headquarters began planning to replace the P-47 entirely. The future they believed belonged to a lighter fighter, the P-51 Mustang. The Thunderbolt program looked like a failed experiment. But at RAF Halesworth, one commander saw something different. Colonel Hubert Zemke had spent years testing the P-47 before the war. He didn't argue with the numbers. He accepted them. The P-47 couldn't turn. No amount of courage or skill would change that. But Zemke understood something the Luftwaffe and even his own commanders had overlooked. The Thunderbolt didn't need to turn. Because while it couldn't outturn the enemy, it could do something no German fighter could survive trying to match. It could dive. And once Zemke stopped fighting the war, the Germans expected the balance of power in the skies was about to change. Colonel Hubert Zemke didn't argue with physics. He didn't complain about the Thunderbolt's weight. He didn't ask for a different aircraft. He accepted reality. The P-47 Thunderbolt could not turn with German fighters. Every pilot knew that. The Luftwaffe knew it too. So Zemke stopped trying to win the fight the Germans wanted. Instead, he looked at what the Thunderbolt could do. At the heart of the P-47 was the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, 2,000 horsepower, driving a huge airframe built like a flying tank. Its thick wings and reinforced structure could survive speeds that would tear lighter fighters apart. The Thunderbolt couldn't dance, but it could fall out of the sky like a hammer. In a vertical dive, nothing in the Luftwaffe inventory could catch it. And more importantly, nothing could safely follow it. That was the moment everything changed. Zemke rewrote the rules for his pilots. No dogfights, no turning contests, no chasing enemies through horizontal maneuvers. Altitude became currency. Every mission followed the same logic: start high, dive fast, fire once, blow through the enemy formation. Use speed to climb back to safety. Never get slow. Never turn with the enemy. Fight in 3 dimensions, not 2. Zemke drilled this into the 56th Fighter Group relentlessly. Pilots practiced high-speed gunnery passes. They learned energy management, how to trade height for speed, for position, and position for survival. To many pilots trained in classic dogfighting, it felt wrong, unnatural, almost cowardly. But Zemke reminded them of the math. A P-47 didn't need to outturn a German fighter. It only needed to hit first and leave before the enemy could respond. By late summer 1943, the 56th Fighter Group was no longer flying escort the old way. They weren't flying with the bombers. They were hunting above them. And on October 4th, 1943, Zemke decided it was time to find out if his calculations worked in real combat. October 4th, 1943. Dawn broke cold and clear over RAF Halesworth. On the hard-stand ground crews fueled 52 P-47 Thunderbolt for a bomber escort mission deep into Germany. For most fighter groups, it would have been routine. For Colonel Hubert Zemke, it was a test. Every pilot climbing into a cockpit that morning knew the odds. German radar would see the bombers coming. Fighter controllers would scramble dozens, maybe hundreds of interceptors. And everyone knew what usually happened next. German fighters attacked from above. They dove through the bomber formations. They turned away before American escorts could react. Zemke had no intention of letting that happen. The mission briefing included one critical detail: the bombers would cruise at 22,000 feet. Zemke placed his Thunderbolts at 30,000 feet, 8,000 feet higher, 8,000 feet of stored energy. He wasn't escorting the bombers in the traditional sense. He wasn't flying beside them. He was setting a trap. Shortly after crossing the Dutch coast, German radar stations lit up. Luftwaffe controllers scrambled interceptor units to meet the incoming bombers. Fighter formations began climbing into position exactly as doctrine dictated. From above, Zemke watched them assemble. At 18,000 feet, the German fighters were preparing to dive. They never looked up. At 09:52, Zemke rolled his Thunderbolt into a steep dive. Behind him, 51 more followed. 7 tons of aircraft and ammunition tipped nose down toward the earth. Airspeed indicators climbed 300, 350, 400 miles per hour. The German pilots were still focused on the bombers below when the first burst of .50 caliber fire tore through a cockpit. What followed lasted barely 90 seconds. Thunderbolts screamed through the German formation at speeds no enemy fighter could match. Each pilot fired once, blew through, and kept going, never slowing, never turning. German fighters tried to react. They broke formation. They pulled into turns. Some dove away. Physics decided the rest. Lighter aircraft blacked out under the G-forces. Others simply came apart. When the Thunderbolts climbed back to altitude, the sky below them was empty. No German fighters reached the bombers, not one. The escort continued uninterrupted. The bombers hit their targets. They turned for home. By the time the 56th Fighter Group landed back at Halesworth, the initial reports sounded impossible. Dozens of enemy aircraft destroyed, no American losses. But the gun cameras would confirm it. October 4th, 1943 was real. And for the first time, the Luftwaffe had encountered something it did not understand. A fighter that refused to turn. A commander who fought with mathematics. And a tactic that had just rewritten the balance of power in the sky. The reports from October 4th sent shockwaves through 8th Air Force headquarters. Gun camera footage confirmed it. Radar tracks matched pilot claims. Every kill checked out. Colonel Hubert Zemke had proven his point, but victory raised an uncomfortable question. Was this a breakthrough, or just one perfect day? The Luftwaffe still had hundreds of fighters. German industry was still producing aircraft faster than the Allies could destroy them. And the strategic bombing campaign was far from over. So the missions continued. Day after day, weather permitting, American bombers pushed deep into Germany. And every mission drew massive German fighter responses. On October 8th, escort to Bremen, German formations formed up to attack. The 56th Fighter Group struck first from above. 6 enemy fighters destroyed. No American losses. October 10th, another maximum effort raid. More than 60 German fighters attempted to break through. Zemke's pilots hit them in successive diving passes. The bombers returned untouched. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Wherever the 56th Fighter Group flew, German attacks failed. Where they didn't, bombers burned. Still, the test was not complete. Everyone on both sides knew the real measure would come over Schweinfurt. The ball-bearing factories there were critical to German war production. They were also among the most heavily defended targets in Europe. The first raid had already proven costly. A second strike was planned for October 14, 1943. This time, the Luftwaffe would not hold back. Over 300 German fighters would be committed, every available unit, every experienced pilot. The 56th Fighter Group would be there too. But on that morning, Zemke would not be in the air. As bombers formed up and engines warmed, the question hung over the mission like a storm cloud. Had the Thunderbolt finally found the winning formula? Or was October 4th only a brief illusion before reality reasserted itself? The answer would be written in smoke and fire over Schweinfurt, and it would cost thousands of lives. From a tactical standpoint, Colonel Hubert Zemke had already won the argument. The new P-47 doctrine worked. The numbers proved it. Where the 56th Fighter Group flew, German fighters were intercepted before they reached the bombers. Altitude advantage converted into speed, speed into surprise, surprise into kills. But air war is not decided by tactics alone. It is decided by scale. The second raid on Schweinfurt exposed the limit of Zemke's system, not in theory, but in application. The problem wasn't how the Thunderbolts fought. It was how many enemies they faced and how far they had to fly. On October 14, 1943, more than 300 German fighters rose to defend Schweinfurt. They came in waves, from multiple directions, at multiple altitudes. Even perfect tactics struggle when the numbers no longer balance. Zemke's doctrine required three conditions: altitude superiority, freedom to disengage, enough escorts to cover the bomber stream continuously. Over Schweinfurt, all three were under pressure. Escort fighters were still limited by range. As fuel ran low, formations had to turn back. Gaps opened inevitably. German controllers understood this. They didn't need to defeat the escorts. They only needed to outlast them. When American fighters peeled away, the Luftwaffe surged forward. The result was brutal but logical. The Thunderbolts fought well. They shot down enemy fighters. In many sectors, they dominated the air. But domination in one slice of sky wasn't enough. The bomber stream stretched for miles, and no single fighter group, no matter how skilled, could be everywhere at once. This was the hard truth. Schweinfurt revealed Zemke's tactics solved the fighter problem. They did not yet solve the escort problem. The U.S. Army Air Forces faced a strategic dilemma. They now knew how to fight and win air combat, but they still lacked enough long-range fighters, enough continuous coverage, enough margin for error deep inside Germany. Schweinfurt wasn't a failure of innovation. It was proof that innovation alone was not enough. And yet this was not the end of the story. Because what Schweinfurt proved brutally and unmistakably was this: the Luftwaffe could still kill bombers, but it could no longer defeat American fighters outright. The balance was shifting, slowly, painfully, at an unbearable cost. And in the next part of this story, that cost would finally be paid in full. October the 14th, 1943. The sky over Schweinfurt did not care about doctrine. It cared about numbers. Hundreds of bombers droned forward in tight formation, their contrails marking them like targets across the sky. Inside those aircraft were young men, engineers, gunners, navigators, many flying their 10th mission, some their first. They trusted the escorts. They believed the fighters would be there. But air war is not fought in belief. It is fought in minutes and miles. As fuel gauges crept downward, American escort fighters began to peel away. Not because they were defeated, not because they lost control of the air, because they had reached the edge of their range. The sky did not go silent when they turned back. It exploded. German fighters surged into the gaps, not in neat formations, but in relentless waves. From above, from below, from the flanks. They did not need to win the air battle. They only needed to reach the bombers. Inside the B-17's 50 caliber guns chattered continuously. Gunners tracked targets until their barrels glowed. Some fighters fell away trailing smoke. Others kept coming. Bomber formations disintegrated. Damaged aircraft lost speed, slipped out of position, and became isolated. Once alone, survival time was measured in seconds. Over Schweinfurt, the sky filled with burning aircraft, engines on fire, wings torn away, parachutes opening sometimes. For the men inside those bombers, there was no strategy, no doctrine, no mathematics, only the sound of flak tearing through aluminum. Only the smell of smoke, only the knowledge that staying in formation meant death, and leaving it meant dying alone. By the time the surviving bombers turned for home, the cost was unmistakable. 68 B-17s destroyed. Hundreds of airmen killed or captured. The worst single-day loss in the history of the 8th Air Force. And yet, this was the cruel irony of Schweinfurt. The fighters had not failed. The Thunderbolts had fought well. They had killed German pilots. They had proven the Luftwaffe could be beaten. But they could not be everywhere, and they could not stay forever. Schweinfurt burned not because the tactics were wrong, but because the war had reached a point where half measures were no longer survivable. That night back in England, air crews stared at empty bunks. Mechanics counted aircraft that never returned. Commanders studied maps covered in red grease pencil marks. The question was no longer whether the Americans could win the air war. It was whether they could afford the price it was demanding. And deep down, everyone understood the truth Schweinfurt had revealed. Until American fighters could go all the way, the bombers would keep dying. Schweinfurt did not stop the bombing campaign, but it ended the illusion. In the days after October 14, 1943, 8th Air Force commanders faced a reality they could no longer avoid. The problem was no longer courage. It was not training. It was not even tactics. It was reach. American fighters could win air battles. They had proven that, but they could not stay. Every mile deeper into Germany stretched the escort thinner. Every minute in the air drained fuel that could not be replaced. And every gap, no matter how small, became an invitation for the Luftwaffe. Schweinfurt made the conclusion unavoidable. If bombers were going to survive, fighters had to go all the way. For some commanders, the answer was simple. Wait. Wait for more long-range fighters. Wait for more P-51 Mustangs. Suspend deep raids until technology caught up with ambition. Others argued something different. They argued that the answer was already in the air. Colonel Hubert Zemke and the 56th Fighter Group had shown what was possible, not by changing aircraft, but by changing how they were used. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never meant to fly slow and close to bombers. It was meant to dominate space above them. What it lacked was endurance. And endurance, unlike agility, could be engineered. Engineers began working on extended-range solutions. External fuel tanks, drop tanks, precise fuel management plans that treated every gallon as part of the battle. At the same time, doctrine changed. Fighter escorts were no longer told to stick close. They were told to range ahead, to hunt German fighters before they could even form up, to deny the Luftwaffe the initiative entirely. The mission was no longer escort, it was air superiority. Schweinfurt had proven something crucial. The Luftwaffe was not invincible, but it would not collapse overnight. To defeat it, the Americans would have to do something no Air Force had ever done before: send fighter escorts farther into enemy territory than anyone believed possible. Not once, not as a stunt, but every day. The problem Schweinfurt exposed was brutally simple. The fighters ran out of sky, so the Americans decided to extend it. During the winter of 1943, engineers and planners worked the problem backward, not from tactics, but from fuel gauges. Every mile toward Germany was measured. Every minute in the air was calculated. The solution came not as a new aircraft, but as an add-on: external fuel tanks. For the P-47 Thunderbolt, this was a gamble. Fully loaded with drop tanks, the Thunderbolt became even heavier, slower, to climb, more vulnerable during the most dangerous phase of flight: takeoff. A fully fueled P-47 now weighed nearly 9 tons. Pilots needed every foot of runway just to get airborne. If German fighters intercepted them during the climb, the consequences would be disastrous. Colonel Hubert Zemke approached the problem the only way he knew how: with mathematics. The solution was timing. The Thunderbolts would take off heavy, climb slowly over England in the North Sea, burn the external fuel first, and only then, at a precise point over enemy territory, drop the tanks. Too early, and the fighters would never reach the target. Too late, and they would enter combat, overweight and vulnerable. Zemke set the drop point like a tripwire in the sky. Cross the coast, drop the tanks, enter combat at full performance. For the pilots, it required discipline bordering on obsession. No improvisation, no panic, no deviation. Fuel was no longer just endurance. It was part of the weapon system. By February 1944, the pieces were in place. The bombing campaign was about to resume at a scale never attempted before. Not one city, not one raid, but a sustained assault on the German aircraft industry itself. 6 consecutive days, hundreds of bombers per mission, every available fighter in the inventory. The operation would be known as Big Week. For the Luftwaffe, it was meant to be decisive. For the Americans, it was something more dangerous. February 1944. The waiting ended. When the weather cleared, the United States launched Big Week, 6 days of non-stop attacks on Germany's aircraft industry. Nearly 1,000 bombers per mission, the largest air offensive the war had seen. This time, the escort stayed. For the first time, P-47 Thunderbolt carried enough fuel to range far ahead of the bombers. Heavy at takeoff, they climbed patiently, burning egged external fuel over the North Sea. Over the Dutch coast, the pilots released their drop tanks. Now at combat weight, the Thunderbolts kept climbing. German radar detected the bombers early and scrambled everything available, FW-190s and BF-109s rising in waves. But when they moved to intercept, they found something unfamiliar. American fighters were already there. Not flying close escort, not reacting, waiting. Across hundreds of miles of sky, the air war fractured into dozens of fast, violent encounters. Thunderbolts dove on German formations as they assembled, breaking attacks before they could begin. For the first time, German pilots were being attacked before they ever saw a bomber. The Luftwaffe fought back hard, losses mounted on both sides. Flak still tore into bomber formations. But something had changed. Altitude belonged to the Americans. Speed belonged to the Americans. And initiative finally belonged to the Americans. Big Week did not destroy the Luftwaffe, but it broke its control of the battle. And once that control was gone, there was only one place this war was heading next: Berlin. When the impossible finally broke, March 6, 1944, the target was Berlin. For years it had been unreachable. Every bomber raid ended the same way: escorts turned back, bombers burned. This time, the escorts stayed. Long-range, P-47 Thunderbolts crossed into Germany heavy with fuel, climbed patiently, then dropped their tanks at the edge of combat. High, fast, ready. German radar saw everything. The Luftwaffe launched nearly every fighter it had. But when German formations tried to assemble, American fighters were already above them, diving, striking, breaking attacks before they began. Over Berlin, the sky became chaos, fighters climbing diving tracers everywhere. Flak took its toll, but one thing did not happen. German fighters did not reach the bombers over the target. For the first time, American fighters escorted bombers all the way to the heart of Germany and back. Berlin did not end the air war, but it ended the debate. From that day on, the Luftwaffe no longer controlled when and where battles were fought. American fighters did. Losses mounted, experience vanished, fuel ran out, and the skies over Europe slowly emptied of German aircraft. The turning point did not come from a new airplane. It came from a decision. The P-47 could not turn. So Hubert Zemke stopped trying to make it turn. He fought with altitude, with speed, with physics. And once that happened, the outcome of the air war was inevitable. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never redesigned. Its wings stayed thick. Its weight never changed. Its turning radius remained the same. What changed was understanding. Under the leadership of Hubert Zemke, the 56th Fighter Group became the highest-scoring fighter unit in the 8th Air Force. Not because they flew harder, but because they flew smarter. They refused to fight the enemy's fight. They trusted physics over instinct. They accepted limitation and turned it into dominance. By 1944, variations of Zemke's tactics spread across the American air forces. Bomber losses fell dramatically. German pilot experience collapsed. Air superiority became a fact, not a hope. And when Allied troops landed in Normandy, the Luftwaffe was largely absent, not by accident, but by design. Zemke himself would not end the war in the cockpit. He was shot down, captured, and spent the final months as a prisoner of war. But his ideas survived him. They flew over Europe every day. They shaped modern air combat, and they proved a lesson that still matters today. Victory does not always belong to the fastest aircraft or the most advanced machine. Sometimes it belongs to the person willing to say, "This cannot do everything, so I will only ask it to do what it does best." The P-47 couldn't turn, so its pilots stopped trying, and in doing so, they changed the war. At 11:17 a.m. over Germany, one American fighter turned back toward 26 enemy aircraft. Below him, 60 bombers carried 600 men home. He could leave and live. Instead, he stayed and changed the air war forever. At 11:17 a.m. over Germany, a single American fighter dove straight into 26 enemy aircraft. No wingman, no backup, no escape route. Just one P-51 Mustang cutting through the cold air at full throttle, flying directly into a storm of guns. Below him, 60 B-17 bombers were limping toward home. 600 men trapped inside aluminum shells, fuel-load defenses thinning already marked as targets. They were minutes from safety and seconds from disaster. The pilot above them had a choice. He had enough fuel to turn west, enough speed to live. One clean break, one smart decision, and he'd make it back to England. But if he stayed, he would be alone, outnumbered, and very likely dead. The Mustang didn't turn. For the next 37 minutes, one pilot, one aircraft, and one impossible decision would hold back an entire enemy force and change how air war was fought over Europe forever. This isn't the story of a machine. It's the story of a man who looked at the odds and refused to run. The pilot in that Mustang wasn't chasing glory. His name was James Howard, and just hours earlier, this mission had looked like any other. Escort the bombers in, stay with them as long as fuel allowed, turn back when ordered, live to fly again tomorrow. Howard had already flown deep into Germany before. He knew the routine. The escorts would peel off near the border. The bombers would press on alone. Losses were expected. That was the math of daylight bombing in 1944. But this time was different. Below him, the bombers weren't just dots on a map. They were men he could see, crews he could picture, ball turret gunners sealed inside glass spheres, pilots gripping throttles, hoping today wasn't their last. Howard watched German fighters forming above the formation. Too many of them, too coordinated, too patient. He checked his fuel. Enough to get home if he left now. Barely. He checked his ammunition. Full. 650 caliber machine guns, thousands of rounds. A powerful aircraft, but still just one. Then the Germans came. Not in a reckless charge, but with discipline. Formation leaders layered attacks, veterans with years of combat behind them. They weren't hunting the Mustang. They were hunting the bombers. Howard knew what that meant. If they broke through, dozens of aircraft would fall. Hundreds of men would die in minutes. Radio calls filled the air. Confusion, fear, silence. Howard pushed the throttle forward and turned back toward the enemy. He didn't announce it. He didn't ask permission. He simply placed his Mustang between the bombers and everything trying to kill them. From that moment on, there would be no safe choice, only the decision to stay. Howard hit them before they could fully commit to the bombers. The Mustang dropped out of the sun like a knife airspeed screaming past 400 miles an hour. He didn't chase stragglers. He didn't spray bullets. He went straight for the leaders, the pilots holding the formation together. 3 seconds on the trigger, 90 rounds. The German fighter's wing folded and vanished in a cloud of debris. Howard didn't follow it down. He never did. He climbed back up, traded speed for altitude, and came again. Dive, fire, extend away. The Mustang was faster than anything the Luftwaffe had at that height, and Howard used every knot of it. German pilots tried to turn with him. They couldn't. They tried to follow him in the climb. They fell behind. One by one, their formations shattered. Inside the bomber stream, gunners watched in disbelief. They'd seen escorts before. They'd seen fighters peel off at the border, leaving them alone over enemy territory. They had never seen one airplane move like this always, between the bombers and the attackers, never slowing, never breaking away. Howard pulled through another high G turn and felt the pressure crush him into the seat. His vision tunneled. Black crept in at the edges. He eased the stick just enough to stay conscious, just enough to keep fighting. German radios lit up. Calls for help. Calls for coordination. This wasn't a green unit being surprised. These were veterans, and they were being dismantled by a single fighter that refused to disengage. Howard checked his ammo counter, already dropping fast. He didn't slow down. Every second he stayed meant the bombers stayed alive. And as long as they were still flying, neither was he done. By the 13th minute, the fight had changed. Howard's Mustang was still flying, but it was no longer perfect. One of his guns froze solid, the metal seized by brutal cold and violent temperature swings. Then another. The trigger felt lighter now, too light. He checked the panel. Ammunition was disappearing faster than time itself. Below him, the bombers were still trapped, still slow, still vulnerable. Howard did the math without slowing down. He had fuel to leave, barely enough to reach England with reserves if he broke away now. The bombers at their speed were still more than half an hour from safety. If he stayed, he'd be running on fumes long before they crossed friendly lines. The Germans sensed it. They stopped scattering. They stopped panicking. Veteran pilots began to regroup, tightening their formations, changing angles, watching the Mustang instead of reacting to it. They had been fighting instinct. Now they were fighting patterns. Howard felt it immediately. Attacks came in layers, head-on passes to force him to break, diving elements waiting above his escape path. They were trying to box him in force. A mistake ended quickly. Standard tactics said, disengage, build speed, extend away. Howard ignored them. He stayed aggressive, more aggressive than before. He dove straight through formations instead of around them, forcing overshoots, turning chaos into his only weapon. When they tried to trap him, he reversed. When they expected him to run, he climbed straight at them, daring them to blink first. Inside the bombers, gunners stopped counting kills and started counting minutes. The Mustang was still there, still fighting, still drawing everything toward itself. Another gun jammed. Howard now had fewer barrels, less ammunition, and a fuel gauge that refused to be ignored. His hands were numb. The cockpit heater had failed. Oxygen pressure flickered. Every breath felt thinner. But the bombers were still flying. As long as they were airborne, Howard stayed between them and the enemy. Not because it was smart, not because it was survivable, but because leaving now would mean watching 600 men die behind him. And that was the one thing he would not do. By now, the Germans weren't trying to reach the bombers anymore. They were hunting the Mustang. 19 fighters circled above the formation, disciplined, patient, closing in tighter each minute. They'd lost comrades. They'd lost formation leaders. And now they understood something dangerous this American wasn't leaving. He was running out of time, fuel, and ammunition, but he wasn't backing down. Howard checked his guns. Only a few still worked. His ammo counter dropped into double digits. Seconds of fire left. Not minutes. Seconds. The Luftwaffe came in waves. Howard met the first head-on, firing a short burst at point-blank range. One enemy fighter erupted in flame and fell away. He pulled vertical bled speed, then rolled and dove back down into the second wave before they could adjust. Another burst. Another aircraft crippled. But now the advantage was gone. He was lower, slower, beneath them instead of above. The Germans had altitude numbers and the sun. Tracers ripped past his canopy. Cannon rounds tore holes through his wings. The Mustang shuddered controls, turning soft and unresponsive. Howard fired again. Click. Silence. No recoil. No muzzle flash. His guns were empty. 18 German fighters closed in on an unarmed American plane. Any pilot would have run. Any doctrine said disengage. Survival was still possible if he turned away now. Howard turned toward them instead. He dove at the nearest fighter with nothing but speed and nerve, closing so fast the German pilot broke in panic. Another followed, then another. The enemy began to scatter not because they were beaten, but because they didn't understand what they were seeing. A fighter that wouldn't fire. A pilot who wouldn't flee. Inside the bomber stream, crews watched the impossible unfold. The Mustang was still there, still pulling enemy aircraft away, still buying seconds, then minutes. Howard's fuel gauge crept toward empty. Oxygen thinned. His hands shook from cold and exhaustion. But the bombers were still flying. And as long as they were in the air, he would not leave them alone. The Germans finally changed their plan. If they couldn't kill the Mustang, they would ignore it. 8 fighters stayed high to keep Howard busy. The rest rolled over and dove straight for the bombers, throttles wide open. It was the right call. Brutal, efficient, textbook Luftwaffe doctrine. Howard saw the split instantly. He had no guns, barely any fuel, and only seconds to choose. Fight the fighters chasing him or save the bombers that couldn't run. He rolled toward the diving formation. The Mustang screamed downhill speed, climbing past 400 miles an hour. Howard lined up on the lead German fighter from behind, close enough to see the pilot's helmet, close enough to feel the prop wash. He didn't fire. He couldn't. But he didn't break away either. The German pilot looked back. No muzzle flashes, no tracers, just a silver nose filling his canopy. He broke hard. His wingman followed. The formation unraveled. Howard stayed on them, hurting, pressuring, forcing mistakes. One fighter dove away. Another rolled inverted and fled. One by one, the attackers peeled off, not destroyed, but neutralized by pure aggression. Above him, the remaining Germans dove. Howard pulled up to meet them, climbing until the Mustang hung on its propeller. Airspeed bled away. The stall warning screamed. Tracers ripped past his wings. One round punched through the tail. Another clipped an aileron. The aircraft shuddered violently. He shoved the nose down dove-built speed, then pulled back up behind them again. Fuel warnings flashed red. He had minutes left, maybe less. Then dots on the horizon. Dark shapes growing fast. Thunderbolts. Dozens of them. American fighters pouring in from the west. The Germans saw them too. At last, the attack broke. One by one, enemy fighters turned east and vanished into the distance. The sky fell quiet. Howard eased off the throttle hands, shaking, vision narrowing. His engine coughed. He leaned the mixture and prayed. Below him, 60 bombers flew on scarred, damaged, but alive. Howard followed them home. He had nothing left to give, but it had been enough. The fight was over, but Howard didn't feel relief. As the bombers droned west, his Mustang trembled beneath him like an exhausted animal. The fuel gauge hovered just above empty. The engine sputtered once, then smoothed out as he leaned the mixture, coaxing every last drop from the tanks. His hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from cold oxygen debt and 37 minutes of unbroken combat. Below, the bombers held formation. They were damaged, scarred, but every single one was still flying. American fighters slid in around them, thunderbolts filling the sky at last. One pilot pulled alongside Howard and gave a thumbs up. Howard barely nodded back. He didn't have the strength for anything more. Crossing the English coast, his fuel warning light glowed red. When he finally touched down, the Mustang rolled to a stop with barely enough fuel left to taxi. The canopy opened. Cold air rushed in. Howard sat still for several seconds, then climbed out his legs, nearly giving way beneath him. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft. They counted the damage in silence. Bullet holes stitched across the wings and fuselage. Cannon strikes that had missed fuel tanks by inches. Frozen guns, empty belts. An airplane that should not have made it home. Howard walked around the Mustang with his crew chief answering questions with shrugs. When asked how many enemy fighters he'd destroyed, he hesitated. Maybe 3. Maybe 4, he said. Hard to tell in the fight. Across England, bomber crews were landing too. Men climbed out of aircraft they never expected to see again. And they all told the same story. One Mustang, one pilot, staying when no one else could. Intelligence officers compared reports, mission logs, gun camera footage. The truth became impossible to ignore. Howard hadn't just survived. He had held off an entire enemy force alone. And the war would never look at fighter pilots the same way again. What happened over Germany that morning didn't stay in the sky. Within hours, intelligence officers began piecing it together. Not from one report, but from dozens. Different crews, different aircraft, same story. A single P-51 Mustang had stayed with the bombers long after every escort should have turned back. It had fought alone, and it had never left their side. Gun camera footage confirmed it. 11 enemy aircraft destroyed, more damaged. But numbers alone didn't explain what the bomber crews described. They talked about time, about how the attacks never seemed to break through, about how the German fighters kept turning away as if something was holding them back. That something was James Howard. 2 days later, senior commanders arrived at the airfield. They wanted details. They wanted explanations. Howard gave them none. He downplayed it. Said he was just doing his job. Said it happened fast. Said he didn't remember much beyond staying with the bombers. They pressed harder. What they finally understood was this: Howard hadn't just fought bravely. He had rewritten the rules. Before that day, fighters stayed close, defensive, reactive. After January 11, 1944, escort doctrine changed. Fighters were unleashed, told to hunt, to dominate the air instead of merely shielding bombers from it. The Mustang proved it could do more than escort. It could control the sky. 6 weeks later, on a cold English morning, James Howard stood on the same airfield where his Mustang had limped home nearly empty. This time the engines were silent. The formation was ceremonial, and the metal placed around his neck carried words that could never fully capture what had happened. He was the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive the Medal of Honor during the war. not for how many aircraft he destroyed, but for how many lives he brought home. 600 men walked away from that mission because one pilot refused to abandon them. And long after the smoke cleared and the war moved on, those men remembered one thing above all else. When everything else turned back, one Mustang stayed. The paperwork called it a mission. The men who flew it called it something else. In the days that followed, bomber crews began asking questions. Who was the pilot who stayed? What squadron? What name stories spread across airfields and mess halls? One Mustang. One man, 37 minutes. 60 bombers untouched. It sounded impossible until the crews started finding him. A week later, men from the bomber group traveled to Howard's base. They didn't come with cameras or commanders. They came quietly. Some shook his hand, some struggled to speak. One gunner told Howard he had watched the entire fight from his turret, counting every pass, every dive, certain he was witnessing his own last moments in the sky. He told Howard he was alive because that Mustang never left. Years later, that same gunner would name his first son James. Howard never talked much about that day. He flew more missions. He shot down more enemy aircraft. But nothing ever matched January 11th, because it was never about numbers. It was about staying when every instinct, every regulation, and every survival calculation said to leave. After the war, the Mustang became legend. Escort ranges stretched to Berlin and back. Bomber losses dropped. Air superiority shifted permanently. The Luftwaffe never recovered. And buried inside doctrine manuals and training lectures was an unspoken truth. Aggression, when guided by discipline and purpose, could change everything. Howard went on with his life. He tested jets, trained new pilots, served until the uniform finally came off. He lived long enough to see the world he helped shape and to know that what he had done mattered far beyond one mission. But on that January morning over Germany, none of that existed yet. There was only a sky full of enemies, a formation of bombers that couldn't defend themselves, and one pilot who made a decision that echoed through history. He didn't stay to become a hero. He stayed so others could go home. And sometimes that's how legends are born. Long after the war ended, the numbers faded. Sorties flown, aircraft destroyed, medals awarded, all of it blurred with time. But one thing never did the lesson of that morning over Germany. Every fighter pilot who trained after 1944 learned it whether they knew the name or not. Speed is life. Altitude is insurance. And when everything goes wrong, initiative decides who lives. James Howard understood that before it was written into manuals. He proved it not in a briefing room, but alone in the sky with empty guns and a failing engine, choosing to stay when no one would have blamed him for leaving. History remembers victories. It remembers aces and machines and formations. But sometimes history pivots on something quieter, on a man who refuses to abandon others even when the cost is almost everything he has. Howard didn't win that fight because he was invincible. He won it because he was relentless, because he never gave the enemy what they expected, and because courage, when combined with skill, can bend probability itself. 60 bombers returned that day. 600 men stepped back onto English soil. They went on to live full lives, families, children, futures that would have ended in smoke and fire if one pilot had turned away. Howard lived too, long enough to watch new generations take the sky he once fought for, long enough to know that what he did wasn't repeatable and never should be. Heroics aren't doctrine. They are exceptions born of necessity. But on January 11th, 1944, necessity called for one thing only: stay. One pilot, one aircraft. 37 minutes that reshaped an air war and saved hundreds of lives. Not because he was ordered to, but because he chose to be there when it mattered most. And that is why decades later, his story still matters, not as a tale of destruction, but as proof of what determination can achieve when everything else is gone. Years passed. The war moved on. Then it ended. The skies over Europe fell silent, but the lessons forged in combat did not. Fighter pilots who came after James Howard trained in a world shaped by what he proved that day. They learned to think offensively, to seize initiative, to understand that hesitation in the air was often deadlier than enemy fire. Manuals changed. Doctrine evolved. But at the core of it all was a simple truth. Air superiority was not claimed by caution, but by resolve. Howard returned home quietly. No parades, no speeches. He stayed in uniform, flew jets, tested new aircraft, helped prepare a new generation for wars yet to come. He never chased the story of January 11th. He never needed to. The men who mattered already knew it. Across America, bomber crews built lives that should have ended over Germany. They married, they raised children, they grew old. And every one of those futures traced back to a single winter morning when a lone fighter stayed where it didn't have to. Howard lived long enough to see his actions become history, to see the Mustang remembered as the fighter that helped win the air war, to see young pilots speak his name with quiet respect, not because of how many enemy aircraft he destroyed, but because of how many people he saved. When he passed away, there were no formations overhead, no roaring engines in salute. But his legacy was already written across decades of aviation history. It lived in every escort mission that reached its target and came home intact. In every pilot taught to protect those who could not protect themselves. Some battles are won by armies. Some wars are shaped by machines. But every so often, history turns on a single moment when one person decides that leaving is not an option. On January 11th, 1944, James Howard made that choice. And because he did, hundreds of lives went on. That is how the story ends. History often remembers wars through maps and dates, arrows on charts, lines advancing and retreating. But the truth of war lives elsewhere, inside moments that never make it into strategy books. Moments when no one is watching, when no order is given, when a single decision carries the weight of hundreds of lives. January 11th, 1944 was one of those moments. There was no grand plan that morning calling for one fighter to stand alone. No doctrine that demanded a pilot stay until his guns were empty and his fuel nearly gone. What happened over Germany was not designed. It emerged from necessity, instinct, and responsibility. James Howard didn't wake up intending to become a symbol. He took off to do a job to escort bombers as far as he was told, and to come home if he could. But war rarely respects intention. It demands choice. And when that choice came, he made it without hesitation. In the years that followed, the story spread quietly, passed from pilot to pilot, from instructor to student, not as a tale of hero worship, but as a reminder of what the mission truly meant. Protect those who cannot protect themselves. Hold the line when others depend on you. Understand that sometimes the cost of leaving is greater than the risk of staying. The sky, James Howard fought in no longer exists. The aircraft are gone. The men are gone. But the standard remains. Every time a pilot stays with a vulnerable formation, every time someone chooses duty over self-preservation, every time courage fills the gap where plans fall apart, that legacy lives on. The battle ended in 37 minutes. The lesson endured for generations. Because on one winter morning in thin air and freezing cold, a single pilot proved something timeless. That one person in the right place at the right moment can hold back the impossible. And that sometimes history doesn't change because of orders given, but because someone chose to stay. In the end, there was no explosion that marked the moment history changed. No headline announced it. No trumpet sounded in the sky over Germany. The world simply kept moving because 600 men were still alive to move within it. That is how most turning points happen. James Howard didn't see himself as the center of a story. He saw himself as a barrier, something that stood in the way long enough for others to escape. When his guns ran dry, he used speed. When speed ran out, he used nerve. When logic failed, he used will. And when there was nothing left to give, he stayed anyway. The war rolled on. More missions were flown. More battles were fought. But something fundamental had shifted. The enemy learned that American fighters would not simply escort and withdraw. They would pursue. They would dominate. And they would not abandon those placed in their care. Long after the last Mustang landed and the last bomber shut down its engines, the meaning of that day endured. Not in medals or citations, but in the quiet understanding shared by those who had been there. That survival sometimes depends not on plans or numbers, but on whether one person refuses to step aside. Howard never asked to be remembered, but memory has a way of clinging to moments when the cost of courage is absolute. His story endured because it spoke to something timeless, the idea that duty does not end when the odds turn hopeless. On January 11th, 1944, over a frozen stretch of enemy sky, one pilot stayed when leaving made sense. He stayed when no one would have judged him for turning away. At 2:47 p.m. on January 29, 1945, First Sergeant Leonard Funk stepped around the corner of a shattered farmhouse in Holzheim, Belgium, and stopped cold. 90 German soldiers were standing in front of him, not tied up, not guarded, not surrendering. They were staring straight at him. Half of them already had weapons in their hands. The others were bending down, calmly picking rifles out of a pile lying in the snow. 4 American GIs knelt nearby with their hands locked behind their heads. Funk recognized them instantly. They were his men. 20 minutes earlier, those Germans had been prisoners of war. Now they were free-armed and organizing to strike Company C from behind. A German officer stepped forward and jammed an MP-40 submachine gun into Funk's stomach. He screamed an order in German, his face red with rage. Funk didn't understand a word, but he understood the math. 90-1. No cover, no backup, no escape. One squeeze of the trigger, and he would be dead. And then in a moment when any sane man would have surrendered, Leonard Funk began to laugh. Not a nervous chuckle, real laughter, loud, uncontrollable. The officer froze. The Germans hesitated. Confusion rippled through the line. They had never seen this before. What none of them knew was that in less than 60 seconds, 21 German soldiers would be dead. The rest would be surrendering, and the laughing Americans standing in front of them would earn the Medal of Honor for one of the most unbelievable acts of combat in World War II. The laughter in that frozen Belgian farmyard did not come from madness. It came from a lifetime that had shaped Leonard Funk long before a German gun was pressed into his stomach. He had been born far from battlefields on August 27, 1916, in Braddock Township, Pennsylvania Steel Country. Smoke hung over the Monongahela River. Mills roared day and night. Men learned early that nothing was given and everything was earned. Funk grew up fast. By the time he finished high school, during the depths of the Great Depression, he was already carrying responsibility on his shoulders, helping raise his younger brother, while dreams like college quietly disappeared. When Congress expanded the draft in 1941, Funk didn't dodge it. He answered. 24 years old, 5'5", barely 140 pounds. The kind of man recruiters assumed would push papers behind a desk. Instead, Funk volunteered for the paratroopers, an experiment so dangerous most soldiers called it suicide. Jumping out of aircraft into enemy territory with nothing but fabric cord and faith. Airborne training was designed to break men, endless runs, brutal jumps, bodies hitting the ground wrong. Half washed out, Funk didn't. He endured, quietly, methodically. When he finally stepped out of a C-47 for the first time, every instinct screamed to grab the door and live. He let go anyway. By the time he reached England and joined the 82nd Airborne, Funk was older than most of the men around him. 27 felt ancient among boys, barely old enough to shave. But what he lacked in size, he carried in steadiness. He didn't talk much. He didn't boast. He simply did his job, and when things went wrong, men noticed they felt safer standing near him. That calm would be tested soon, over Normandy, over Holland, and ultimately in a snow-covered Belgian village where surrender was expected and laughter became a weapon. That steadiness was put to the test in the early hours of June 6, 1944, Normandy, D-Day. At 1:30 in the morning, Leonard Funk stood inside a vibrating C-47 as German flak tore holes through the darkness outside. The aircraft shuddered with every explosion. Red tracer rounds sliced past the windows like burning knives. Funk was loaded down with nearly 60 pounds of gear, weapon ammunition, grenades, rations, everything a man needed to fight, and everything that could drown him if he landed wrong. The plane was flying far too low. There was no room to climb, no room to turn back. Then the green light snapped on. Funk stepped into empty air. The prop wash slammed into him like a truck. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but chaos, wind noise, fear. Then the parachute opened, and the world went eerily silent. Below him lay occupied France, enemy territory in every direction, and nothing went according to plan. German fire scattered the airborne drops across miles of countryside. Men drowned in flooded fields, crushed under their own equipment. Others landed directly on enemy positions and were killed before they could free themselves. Funk hit the ground hard. His ankle twisted violently beneath him. The pain was immediate, blinding. Every step would be agony, but he could still walk. And if he could walk, he could fight. Alone and 40 miles from his intended drop zone, Funk buried his parachute and moved into the dark. By dawn, he had gathered other lost paratroopers, men from different units, confused, wounded, scared. They looked to him without discussion. Leadership was not assigned, it was assumed. For 10 days, Funk led that group through German-held territory. They moved at night, hid by day, fought when cornered. Despite his injured ankle, Funk insisted on walking point, placing himself between his men and the unknown. 10 days, 40 miles, not one man lost. When they finally reached Allied lines on June 17th, Funk didn't celebrate. He simply kept going. Normandy had taught him a lesson he would never forget. Chaos favors the man who stays calm when everything else collapses. Normandy didn't slow Leonard Funk down. It hardened him. By the time the summer of 1944 bled into fall, he was no longer just surviving the war. He was moving straight through it, step by deliberate step. On September 17, 1944, the sky over Holland filled with aircraft. Operation Market Garden had begun, the largest airborne assault in history. Tens of thousands of paratroopers dropping into the Netherlands, racing to seize bridges that could crack open Germany itself. If it worked, the war might be over by Christmas. If it failed, men would die surrounded far from help. Funk didn't know the grand strategy. He never did. He only knew his orders: jump, secure the ground. Kill the enemy before they killed you. After landing, Company C did its job. Drop zones secured. Movement forward. Standard airborne work. And then Funk saw something that didn't belong. On high ground nearby, 3 German 20mm anti-aircraft guns were hammering the sky. The barrels flashed again and again, ripping into incoming Allied gliders. Each glider carried men jeeps, artillery, medical supplies, everything airborne troops needed to survive. Every burst meant more bodies before they even touched the ground. The position was well dug in. Sandbags, camouflage, interlocking fields of fire. Around 20 German soldiers defending it. By doctrine, an assault like that required overwhelming numbers. Funk had 3 men. He didn't hesitate. Leading from the front, Funk moved uphill into fire. Bullets snapped past them. Dirt kicked up around their boots. There was no cover, no pause, no safe angle. Only forward. They hit the perimeter hard, killing the security detachment before the gunners could react. Funk charged straight into the gun pits, firing point blank, silencing one weapon, then the next, then the third. In minutes, it was over. 20 Germans lay dead or dying. The guns went silent. The gliders came in untouched. For that action, Funk would receive the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. Most men would carry such a moment for the rest of their lives. Funk barely had time to register it, because the war wasn't finished with him yet, and it was about to show him something that would change how he faced death forever. Holland ended, but whatever illusions remained about this war ended with it. On December 16, 1944, the Germans struck back with everything they had left. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, 3 armies surged forward under cover of snow and fog. Tanks, artillery, infantry. Hitler's final gamble. For the Americans, it was chaos. Units shattered, lines collapsed. Men surrendered simply to survive the cold. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. The weather was merciless. Temperatures plunged below zero. Weapons froze. Trucks wouldn't start. Men died in foxholes without ever seeing the enemy. And then one day into the offensive, something happened that spread through the American army faster than any official order ever could. Near a crossroads outside Malmedy, a group of American soldiers, artillery observers, radio men, rear echelon troops ran into an SS armored column. They were hopelessly outmatched. After a brief fight, 113 Americans surrendered, hands raised, weapons dropped, prisoners of war. They were marched into a snowy field. And then the SS opened fire. Machine guns tore through the line. Pistols finished the wounded. Men who tried to crawl away were hunted down and executed at point-blank range. 84 Americans were murdered in the snow. Some survived by lying perfectly still among the dead blood freezing to their clothes as German boots walked past them. When night fell, 43 men crawled back to American lines and told what they had seen. The message was unmistakable. This war no longer had rules. When Leonard Funk heard about Malmedy, something inside him locked into place. Normandy had taught him chaos. Holland had taught him initiative. Malmedy taught him certainty. He understood now what surrender meant when SS units were involved. He understood what happened to men who trusted the enemy to show restraint. From that moment on, Funk made a quiet decision. He never spoke it out loud. He didn't need to. He would never surrender. Not to save himself. Not for the odds. Not with a gun to his chest. And very soon in a snow-covered Belgian village, that decision would be tested when surrender was demanded and laughter became the only answer. By late January 1945, the German offensive had been smashed. The bulge was collapsing. Now it was the Allies who were advancing slowly, brutally through snow ice and shattered villages. The Ardennes no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a graveyard that hadn't finished filling yet. Company C of the 508th Parachute Infantry received orders to take a small Belgian village called Holzheim. On a map, it looked insignificant. 15 houses, a crossroads, another name to be erased. But there was a problem. Company C was badly under strength. The executive officer had been killed. Too many men were wounded or gone. There weren't enough rifles to do the job cleanly. Leonard Funk was now acting executive officer. He studied the roster, then looked up and made a decision that would have terrified most commanders. He walked into the rear area tents, clerks, cooks, supply men, soldiers whose war had been paper and crates, not bullets. "You're infantry now," he told them. "Grab your weapons. We're taking that village." They marched 15 miles through waist-deep snow under a driving blizzard. German artillery harassed them the entire way. Shells cracked the frozen earth. Men stumbled, exhausted fingers numb inside their gloves. Funk stayed at the front, setting the pace, never slowing. When they reached Holzheim, he didn't give speeches. He gave orders. The assault was fast and violent, house by house, room by room. German machine guns barked from windows. Grenades echoed through hallways. Funk's improvised platoon followed him anyway. Clerks turned riflemen, discovering what fear really felt like. When it was over, 15 houses were cleared. 30 Germans captured. Not a single American casualty. Another unit secured the far side of town and brought in 50 more prisoners. 80 Germans in total. They were herded into the yard of a farmhouse. Funk looked at his men, exhausted, frozen, still shaking from the fight. Resistance remained elsewhere in the village. He could spare only 4 guards. "Keep them here," he said. "We'll send help when we can." Then Funk turned and went back into the battle. He didn't know that a German patrol was already moving through the snow toward that farmhouse. He didn't know his prisoners were about to become attackers. And he didn't know that when he came back alone, everything he had decided after Malmedy would be called due in full. When Leonard Funk turned back toward the farmhouse, It was supposed to be routine. A quick check, a word with the guards, confirmation that the prisoners were still secure. Just another small task in a village already bleeding into silence. He rounded the corner and walked straight into a nightmare. The yard was full of Germans, not sitting, not contained, standing, moving, organizing, rifles in their hands, machine guns being positioned. His 4 guards were on their knees in the snow, disarmed, helpless. The prisoners had been prisoners no longer. A German patrol, ghost-like in white camouflage, had slipped through the chaos and turned everything upside down. There were 90 of them now, 90 armed enemy soldiers, and Funk had walked in alone. For a split second, the world narrowed to cold math. 90 rifles, 1 man, no cover, no time. Somewhere else in the village, Company C was spread thin, clearing houses' backs exposed. If these Germans struck now, it would be slaughter. Funk saw it instantly. He also knew there was no way out. A German officer noticed him. The rank on Funk's sleeve made him a prize. The officer strode forward and slammed an MP-40 into Funk's stomach. He screamed in German voice, cracking with authority and fury. "Surrender. Drop the weapon. End it now." Funk didn't understand the words, but he understood Malmedy. He understood what surrender meant in snow and silence. He looked at his men on their knees. He looked at the weapons lining up behind him. And in that moment, the decision he had made weeks earlier came due. He would not surrender. Instead, Leonard Funk began to laugh. Not softly, not politely. He laughed hard, bending slightly shoulders, shaking. The officer froze, his rage twisting into disbelief. Soldiers glanced at one another, unsure. This wasn't how Americans behaved. This wasn't fear. This wasn't compliance. Those few seconds, those stolen seconds of confusion, were everything. Still laughing, Funk reached slowly for his Thompson, as if finally obeying. The officer watched, relaxing just enough. And then, in one violent motion, Funk ripped the weapon down, brought it to bear, and pulled the trigger. The laughter stopped. The gunfire began. What the German officer saw in that frozen farmyard did not look dangerous. He saw a short American, small frame, snow on his boots, no helmet visor down, no defensive posture. Just a man standing alone, laughing like he had already lost his mind. To the officer, this wasn't courage. It was shock. Fear breaking through the human brain the way it always did. The officer had seen it before. Men cried. Men begged. Men froze. Some laughed right before they collapsed. This American was no different. 90 rifles behind him. 4 prisoners on their knees. The outcome was already decided. So the officer made a fatal assumption. He assumed the American was beaten. He assumed laughter meant surrender was coming. He assumed time was on his side. That was the mistake. Because while the officer was interpreting behavior, Leonard Funk was calculating seconds. While the Germans were waiting for compliance, Funk was measuring distance, weight, angles, and reach. The Thompson on his shoulder wasn't a symbol, it was a solution. The officer leaned in slightly, pressing the MP-40 harder into Funk's stomach. Close enough to smell the cold metal. Close enough to feel control. Around them, German soldiers relaxed just a fraction. Fingers loosened on triggers. No one rushed. No one shouted. They believed the moment had passed. They believed the American had broken. And in war, that belief kills more soldiers than bullets ever will. Because courage doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it laughs. And sometimes it waits for you to blink. The first burst hit the German officer square in the chest. The Thompson roared at point-blank range, 45 caliber rounds slamming into flesh and bone with the force of a sledgehammer. The officer was dead before his body hit the snow. Leonard Funk didn't stop. He couldn't. The moment he pulled that trigger, there was no retreat left in the world. This was no longer about escape or survival. It was about killing fast enough to stay alive. He pivoted, still firing, sweeping the muzzle across the nearest cluster of Germans. Men screamed. Bodies collapsed. Blood sprayed across the white snow, turning it dark and slick beneath their boots. Brass casings poured from the ejection port, hissing as they hit the ice. The magazine ran dry. For an instant, an eternity measured in heartbeats, everything hung in the balance. 90 Germans, 1 American. Reloading meant death if his hands hesitated even once. Funk didn't hesitate. Muscle memory took over. The empty magazine came out. A fresh one slammed home. The bolt racked. Less than 2 seconds. Training compressed into instinct. As he fired again, Funk screamed to his men, "Pick up their weapons! Pick up their weapons!" The 4 American guards lunged for rifles dropped by the dead and dying. Moments ago, they had been prisoners. Now they were fighting back, firing into Germans who had never expected resistance from their captives. Confusion exploded through the yard. Orders died with the officer. No one was in charge. Some Germans fired wildly. Bullets snapped past Funk's head. One round struck the American soldier beside him, killing him instantly. Funk didn't look back. He kept moving, kept shooting. Within seconds, the yard became a killing ground. Germans fell where they stood. Others dropped their weapons and raised their hands, terror replacing arrogance. The ambush collapsed before it ever began. It was over almost as quickly as it had started. 60 seconds. 21 Germans dead. 24 wounded. The rest surrendering, hands high, shaking in disbelief. Leonard Funk stood in the middle of it all, smoke drifting from his Thompson, surrounded by bodies where moments earlier surrender had been demanded. The snow around him was torn apart, churned by boots and blood and brass. That he finally said to his men, his voice flat and calm again, was the stupidest thing I've ever seen. But what Funk didn't say, what history would remember, was that those 60 seconds saved an entire company from being slaughtered from behind. And they sealed his place among the most extraordinary acts of courage ever recorded in war. The silence that followed felt unreal. Smoke drifted lazily above the farmhouse yard. Snow settled again, covering shell casings, broken rifles, and bodies that would never move. What had almost been a massacre ended instead as stunned surrender. The Germans who remained alive were marched away under heavy guard eyes, down shaken by how close they had come to victory and how violently it had been taken from them. Company C secured Holzheim by nightfall. Word spread quickly, the way stories always do in war. Men whispered it in foxholes and aid stations, passing it like contraband. A first sergeant who laughed at 90 Germans. A man who should have died and didn't. A moment so improbable it sounded like myth, but everyone knew it was true. When Leonard Funk reported the incident, he didn't dramatize it. He never did. He stated the facts. Enemy attempted breakout, officer neutralized, prisoners recaptured, just another firefight in a war full of them. But higher up the chain, no one missed what had happened. Overwhelming odds, a weapon pressed into his body, a refusal to surrender, a counterattack that saved an entire company from destruction. The recommendation moved fast. There were no arguments, no debates. The citation spoke for itself. On September 5, 1945, at the White House, President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Funk's neck. Truman looked at the small, quiet paratrooper and said words Funk would never repeat himself, that he would rather have that medal than be President of the United States. By the end of the war, Funk carried more decorations than almost any paratrooper, a live Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service. Cross Silver Star, Bronze Star, multiple Purple Hearts, and foreign awards from France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Medals earned not by seeking glory, but by refusing to fail when everything demanded surrender. Yet when the war ended, Leonard Funk did not become a legend in his own lifetime. He went home. He took a desk job helping other veterans find their way back into life. He never told the story unless pressed, and even then he shrugged it off. Because to Funk, what mattered wasn't the medals. It was the moment he decided long before Holtzheim that when the rules died, when mercy vanished, and when the math said he was finished, he would still act. When the guns finally fell silent, Leonard Funk did something most legends never do. He disappeared. He went back to Pennsylvania, back to steel towns and narrow streets that looked nothing like Normandy hedgerows or frozen Belgian farms. He didn't write a book. He didn't tour the country, telling crowds how close he came to death. He didn't turn his Medal of Honor into a career. Instead, he took a job with the Veterans Administration, sitting behind a desk, helping other men untangle paperwork, file claims, and survive the long, quiet aftermath of war. For 27 years, he did that work, patient, anonymous, necessary. At home, he was a husband, a father of 2 daughters, a man who mowed his lawn and paid his bills. The medals were there somewhere, locked away, rarely mentioned. When people asked about Holtzheim, about the laughter about the 90 Germans, Funk would shrug. Did what I had to do, he'd say, nothing more. On November 20th, 1992, Leonard Alfred Funk Jr. died of cancer at the age of 76. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, among presidents, generals, and thousands of young men who never came home. At the time of his death, he was the last living Medal of Honor recipient from the 82nd Airborne Division of World War II. Today, a fitness center bears his name. A highway carries it. A post office was dedicated to him decades later. Yet most Americans have never heard of Leonard Funk. They know louder heroes, bigger names, men who fit the image. But war doesn't choose heroes by size, strength, or volume. It chooses them in moments when the odds are impossible, when fear is total, when surrender is reasonable. At Holtzheim, Leonard Funk stood with a gun in his stomach and 90 enemies in front of him. The math said he was finished. History said he should have raised his hands. Instead, he laughed. And in 60 seconds, he showed the world what courage really is, not the absence of fear, but the decision to act when fear has already won. At 6 miles high, one mistake meant death. On May 27, 1944, a lone American P-51 climbed straight into the guns of a master German ace. No wingmen, no escape, just steel gravity and a few seconds that decided who would fall out of the sky. Those seconds didn't come out of nowhere. They were forged months earlier in cold English mornings and long bomber routes that seemed to stretch forever. It was May 1944, and Captain Bud Anderson had just crossed an invisible line in the sky. 5 kills, an ace, a title that meant nothing when the engines started and everything when the shooting began. There were no celebrations in the 357th Fighter Group only. New missions, new flak, and the quiet understanding that the biggest fight of the war was coming. Across southern England, airfields buzzed with urgency. D-Day was no longer a rumor. It was a date. And when the invasion came, thousands of American bombers would cross into enemy airspace, slow, heavy, and vulnerable. Keeping them alive fell to the men in the fighters. Escort duty wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting, relentless, and deadly. The Germans knew exactly how to break a bomber stream mass their fighters hit head-on, guns blazing, then vanish. One pass was often enough. Bud would later say it always felt like they were outnumbered. Not because the Germans had more planes, but because they chose where to fight. And when they chose you, there was no warning. By late May, the Luftwaffe was changing. Some pilots were barely trained. Others were veteran survivors, men who had learned every trick in the book and were still flying. From a distance, you couldn't tell which one was coming for you. So every enemy was treated like the best you'd ever face. And soon one of them would prove exactly why. What kept them alive wasn't luck. It was preparation and the machine wrapped around them. By the spring of 1944, the balance in the air was finally beginning to tilt. The Americans had time. Time to train, time to fly, time to master their aircraft. Bud Anderson had logged nearly 900 hours before ever firing a shot in combat. Across the lines, many German pilots were being rushed forward with a fraction of that experience. Some had barely learned how to fight before being sent to die. But that truth was invisible in the sky. At altitude, every Messerschmitt looked dangerous. Every attack could be led by a veteran who had already survived years of war. And there were still plenty of those men, cold, disciplined, lethal, leading the attacks with confidence born from experience. That was why Bud trusted his airplane. The P-51 Mustang wasn't just faster or longer-legged. It could climb, dive, and turn in ways that forgave nothing but rewarded precision. Push it too hard and it would kill you. Fly it right and it might save your life. In the cockpit of his Mustang, Old Crow Bud felt something rare in combat aviation: confidence. Not arrogance, confidence. He knew what his airplane could do. He knew how far he could push it before physics pushed back. And when the shooting started, those margins mattered more than courage ever could. On the morning of May 27, 1944, that confidence would be tested like never before. The 357th lifted off into clear skies, linking up with their bombers as they always did. Engines droned, formation tightened. Another long escort, another run deep into hostile airspace. Nothing about it felt unusual until the radio exploded with urgent calls. Bandits. High. Closing fast. This wasn't a probing attack. This was deliberate. And for one of the only times in Bud Anderson's war, the German fighters weren't hunting bombers, they were hunting him. The warning came too fast to ignore. Voices overlapped on the radio, sharp, urgent, clipped by adrenaline. Shapes appeared behind them, 4 dark specks growing rapidly against the blue. There was no doubt now. Messerschmitts, 4 of them, closing hard. Bud rolled Old Crow into a break as instinct took over. The Mustang snapped into motion, sunlight flashing off wings as both formations slammed into a turning fight. 8 fighters twisting through the sky, each pilot searching for the smallest mistake that could end a life. The Germans had altitude. That mattered. Height meant options. It meant control. And for the first few seconds, it looked like they might press that advantage straight into blood. But the Mustang had its own voice in the fight.